Ja, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, zuvor sagte ich noch, ich darf Sie langsam bitten, Platz zu nehmen. Jetzt darf ich Sie auffordern, rasch Platz zu nehmen. Ich darf Sie herzlich begrüßen bei unserer Veranstaltung Energie Zukunft 2050 vom Verhandeln zum Handeln. Ein Jahr knapp nach der Pariser Klimakonferenz und genau eine Woche nachdem das Pariser Klimaabkommen in Kraft getreten ist und nahe dem Ende einer höchst brisanten Woche in unterschiedlicher Hinsicht dürfen wir die Energiezukunft diskutieren und das aus unterschiedlichen Perspektiven. Diese Veranstaltung ist eine Kooperation mehrerer Umweltorganisationen und Verbände im Bereich erneuerbare Energie. Global 2000, Greenpeace, WWF, IG Windkraft und Erneuerbare Energie Österreich. Und es freut mich, dass die doch recht kurzfristig eingelangte Einladung von uns so zahlreich angenommen wurde und dass wir heute Gelegenheit haben, Energieszenarien zu diskutieren und auch die Frage, wie sich das Pariser Klimaabkommen auf die Energiemärkte auswirken wird. Mein Name ist Georg Günzberg. Ich habe das Vergnügen, bei dieser Veranstaltung mitzuwirken und Sie durch den Vormittag zu führen und auch vielleicht die unangenehme Aufgabe, hin und wieder streng auf die Zeit zu achten, damit wir trotz hohen Diskussionsbedarfs nicht überziehen werden. Wir wollen diese unterschiedlichen Perspektiven deshalb beleuchten, weil wir auch der Meinung sind, dass wenn wir über die zukünftige Klima- und Energiestrategie sprechen, es wichtig ist, vielleicht auch den einen oder anderen Knoten zu lösen, auch unterschiedliche Perspektiven kennenzulernen und hier zu schauen, wie wir wirklich einen Schritt weiterkommen. Ich darf vielleicht kurz was zum Ablauf sagen, bevor wir in medias res gehen. Wir haben circa 3 Blöcke nach der Begrüßung. Einerseits freuen wir uns auf die Keynote Speech von Angus McCrone von Bloomberg New Energy Finance. Wir werden dann jeweils ein kurzes Panel haben mit 3 Gästen, dann einen Vortrag von Steffen Buchholz von Energy Comment in Hamburg, dann wieder ein kurzes Panel und dann eine Präsentation der 3 Umweltorganisationen, wieder mit einem kurzen Panel, nur dass Sie ungefähr die Struktur kennen. Und wie gesagt, ich werde auf die Zeit achten. Ich darf jetzt den Peter Büschböck auf die Bühne bitten, Präsident von Erneuerbare Energie Österreich, für seine einführenden, eröffnenden Worte.
Meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren, vielen Dank für Ihr Kommen, danke für Ihr Interesse. Ich darf Sie auch im Namen des Dachverbandes Erneuerbare Energie Österreich sehr herzlich begrüßen. Der Georg hat das schon kurz angedeutet, diese Woche war eine besondere und für Klimabesorgte, und ich darf mich als so ein Klimabesorgter auch outen, war diese Woche keine gute Woche, wenn die größte Wirtschaftsmacht der Welt einen Präsidenten wählt, der den Klimawandel in Zweifel zieht und zurück zu Kohle und Öl will, dann ist das keine gute Nachricht. Wie immer man es dreht, dieser 8. November war ein Rückschlag und für viele sehr enttäuschend, jedenfalls auch für mich. Mein Naturell erlaubt es aber nicht, im Pessimismus zu verharren. Und Gott sei Dank gibt es auch einige Punkte, die man positiv sehen kann, auch im Hinblick auf die USA. Und ich möchte nur 3 davon herausheben. Ich glaube, dass auch in Amerika, und das wissen wir ja von Studien, die Klimabesorgten in der Mehrheit sind. Und diese Klimabesorgten wissen, dass sie nicht warten können, bis ihnen die Regierung hilft. Und ich glaube, dass hier sehr viele amerikanische Bürger jetzt beginnen werden, ihre Energiewende selbst zu organisieren. Und das ist durchaus eine Chance für einen Boom bei den Erneuerbaren. Es ist aber auch so, dass ja in den USA die Kompetenz für Klima- und Energiefragen vor allen Dingen auf der Ebene der Länder, also der Bundesstaaten liegt. Und dort gibt es sehr, sehr viele Bundesstaaten, denken Sie nur an Kalifornien, die ja führend sind bei einer Energiewende. Und das wird sicher auch so weitergehen. Also ich glaube, auch da muss man nicht unbedingt nur in Pessimismus verfallen. Und dann ist meine ganz große Hoffnung, dass dass nachdem jetzt der Stress des Wahlkampfs vorbei ist, der Herr Trump vielleicht auch einmal Zeit hat, sich erklären zu lassen, wie das denn wirklich ist mit der Energiewende und der Zukunft der Energie. Und da wird er hoffentlich erfahren, dass in Wirklichkeit die Energiewende nicht aufzuhalten ist, und zwar nicht aus klimapolitischen Überlegungen, die kann er vielleicht auf die Seite geben, aber, und das ist ja das Schöne, dass ja die Energiewende ein wirtschaftlich positives Projekt ist, und ich glaube, dass wenn er dazu beiträgt, dass Amerika das versäumt, dass Amerika wirtschaftlich ganz große Nachteile haben wird. Und das glaube ich nicht, daher bin ich nicht ganz so pessimistisch wie vielleicht am 8. November. Schade, dass der Herr Trump keine Zeit hat, heute bei uns zu sein. Es wäre eine sehr, sehr gut verbrachte Zeit. Das würde Amerika helfen und das würde dem Weltklima helfen. Und ich glaube, er würde viel neues Verständnis bekommen. Aber es zeigt auch, und das beschäftigt mich schon länger, dass ich glaube, dass das Thema Energiewende vor allen Dingen auch ein Bildungsproblem ist. Zu wenige Leute wissen, wie ernst das Klimaproblem wirklich ist, und zu wenige Leute wissen, wie deutlich überlegen die erneuerbaren Energien auch wirtschaftlich den fossilen Energien in wenigen Jahren sein werden. Wir sind jetzt schon mehr oder weniger auf dem gleichen Niveau und die Entwicklung geht ganz klar in Richtung der Erneuerbaren. Dieses Bildungsproblem haben wir aber nicht nur in den USA, dieses Bildungsproblem haben wir leider auch in Österreich, und nicht nur die Abwesenheit von Herrn Trump ist bedauerlich, sondern auch die Abwesenheit der österreichischen Politiker ist vor allen Dingen bedauerlich, aber ich habe die große Hoffnung, dass von der vielen Zahl der Menschen, die hier sind, vielleicht auch ein bisschen was nach oben sickern wird und schon langsam auch diese Überzeugung und diese Fakten, die wir heute wahrscheinlich auch hören werden und diskutieren werden, nach oben sickern werden. Es ist ganz wichtig, diese Botschaft weiterzugeben, nämlich die Botschaft, dass das Klimaproblem viel ernster ist, als wir bisher wahrgenommen haben, dass der Ausbau von erneuerbaren Energien der einzige Weg in eine neue Energiezukunft ist. Es gibt keine Alternative. Es ist sehr schön, dass auch in Österreich, zum Beispiel beim Kongress der österreichischen Energie, dieses Faktum ganz klar auf den Tisch gelegt wurde. Es gibt keinen anderen Ausbau mehr von Energie als im erneuerbaren Bereich. Und, liegt mir besonders am Herzen, es muss auch durchsickern, dass die Energiewende ein wirtschaftlich höchst attraktives Projekt ist, das der Wirtschaft enorme Chancen bietet und einen neuen Boom hier auch herbeiführen kann. Es wäre natürlich schön, wenn diese Energiewende, die wir in Österreich ja schon begonnen haben, mit intelligenter Unterstützung der Politik geschehen könnte. Das würde das Ganze beschleunigen und das würde es auch billiger machen. Das ist ein schwieriger Prozess, ein Riesenprojekt, und da brauchen wir ordentliche Strukturen, und dafür ist eigentlich die Politik zuständig. Das Thema, und auf Englisch müsste man dem Herrn Trump sagen, Time is of essence, es ist die Zeit, das Klima kann nicht warten, und auf Österreichisch kann man vielleicht sagen, Zatz an, Burschen. Ich hoffe, dass die kommenden 3 Stunden dazu beitragen werden, dass die Trump-Depression vielleicht überwunden wird, dass wir neue Kraft schöpfen und mit erneuerten Energien für die erneuerbaren Energien kämpfen können. Ich wünsche Ihnen einen schönen, interessanten Vormittag. Danke.
Vielen Dank, Peter Büschböck. Ich weiß jetzt gar nicht, ob ich mich trauen soll zu sagen, dass wir Donald Trump gar nicht eingeladen haben, aber bitte dieses Versäumnis zu entschuldigen. Ich darf als nächste Hanne Simons, politische Direktorin von Greenpeace Österreich, auf die Bühne bitten für ihre Worte.
Ja, sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, ein herzliches Willkommen auch von meiner Seite und im Namen von Greenpeace Österreich. Es freut mich sehr, dass es so ein großes Interesse an dieser Veranstaltung gibt, und ich bedanke mich für Ihr Kommen und freue mich auf eine spannende Diskussion über die Zukunft der Energieversorgung nach dem Pariser Abkommen. Vor genau einer Woche ist das Pariser Klimaabkommen in Kraft getreten und damit ist eine wichtige Weichenstellung erfolgt. Wir kennen jetzt also unser Ziel. Wir wissen auch, bis wann wir dort ankommen wollen. Aber was wir noch nicht wissen, ist, wie kommen wir dorthin, wer geht mit und wer bleibt auf der Strecke. Was wir allerdings schon wissen, ist, dass wir eigentlich jetzt sofort aufbrechen müssen, um noch rechtzeitig anzukommen. Der österreichische Nationalrat hat ja am 8. Juli mit der Ratifizierung in Österreich den Startschuss für Österreich gesetzt und damit auch den Rahmen für die zukünftige Ausrichtung der österreichischen Klima- und Energiepolitik gesetzt. Das Ziel ist, den globalen Temperaturanstieg auf unter 2 Grad Celsius, ja sogar 1,5 Grad Celsius im Vergleich zum vorindustriellen Niveau zu begrenzen. Dieses Ziel wird nicht leicht zu erreichen sein. Es bedeutet nichts weniger als die Energieversorgung und damit auch die Grundlage wichtiger industrieller Prozesse, Dienstleistungen, aber auch individueller Lebensgewohnheiten komplett auf neue Beine zu stellen und einen Strukturwandel voranzutreiben. So müssen wir die Dekarbonisierung auch betrachten. Auf der einen Seite aus klimapolitischer Perspektive als Notwendigkeit zur Rettung des Planeten, aber aus der wirtschaftspolitischen Perspektive auch als Motor eines umfassenden Strukturwandels. Die globale Dynamik, die in der Wirtschaft durch die Neuausrichtung der Klimapolitik zu erwarten ist, ist für Österreich eine große Chance. Es ist völlig klar, dass im Gegensatz dazu eine wenig ambitionierte Klima- und Energiepolitik, die die Folgen der Klimaveränderung unterschätzt und den Umbau der Energieversorgung nicht aktiv angeht, mit sehr hohen ökologischen, ökonomischen und sozialen Risiken verbunden ist. Wichtige Säulen der Politik sind die Reduktion des Endenergieverbrauchs in Österreich um 50% gegenüber 2005, die Reduktion der Treibhausgasemissionen um mindestens 95% gegenüber 1990 und der Ausbau der erneuerbaren Energie auf de facto 100% des Endenergiebedarfs. Das ist eine klare Perspektive. Und eine klare Perspektive schafft auch Sicherheit für Unternehmen. Wer frühzeitig in der Lage ist, sich an den Strukturwandel nicht nur anzupassen, sondern ihn mitzugestalten, wird als Innovationsmotor auch wirtschaftlich erfolgreich sein. Und immer mehr Unternehmen in Österreich sind bereit, diesen Weg auch zu gehen. Der Verhandlungserfolg bei der Pariser Klimakonferenz vor einem Jahr kam unter anderem dadurch zustande, dass es eine Koalition, eine Allianz der Willigen gab, die sogenannte Ambition Coalition, die Druck auf andere Staaten ausübte, dem Klimaabkommen zuzustimmen. Und Österreich war Teil dieser Ambition Coalition. Und Österreich sollte jetzt auch in der Umsetzung ähnlich ambitioniert sein. Und trotz der raschen Ratifizierung von Paris in Österreich ist davon leider nichts oder nicht ausreichend zu bemerken. Sonntagsreden, Eigenlob und freundliche Appelle sind zu wenig. Und viele internationale Beispiele zeigen, dass eine deutlich ambitioniertere Klima- und Energiepolitik möglich ist. Die heutige Tagung bietet einen Rahmen, einen Blick in die Zukunft zu werfen, wie wir in Richtung Dekarbonisierung gehen können und dabei auch jene Barrieren überwinden, die es zu überwinden gilt. Aber die Ziele, die das Pariser Abkommen definiert, gänzlich zu ignorieren, wie das einige Politiker und Unternehmen immer noch tun, ist in höchstem Maße verantwortungslos. Und lassen Sie mich auch noch ein paar Worte über den künftigen Präsidenten der USA sagen. Donald Trump wird den Erfolg des Pariser Klimaabkommens nicht aufhalten können. Erstens, weil ein Ausstieg erst 4 Jahre nach Ratifizierung möglich ist. Zweitens, weil der Klimawandel ja mittlerweile Gott sei Dank ganz oben auf der politischen Agenda steht und ein Ausstieg sicherlich mit sehr hohen politischen Kosten verbunden wäre. Und drittens wird auch ein Leugner des Klimawandels erkennen müssen, dass Investitionen in den Klimaschutz die Jobs bringen, die er versprochen hat, während die fossilen Energieträger an Wettbewerbsfähigkeit verlieren. Für eine rasche Umsetzung des Pariser Klimaabkommens in den USA ist die Wahl Donald Trumps zum US-Präsidenten natürlich ein Rückschlag. Umso größer müssen aber die Bemühungen Österreichs und Europas jetzt sein, eine globale Vorreiterrolle beim Klimaschutz einzunehmen. Und ich hoffe hier auf einen klaren Konsens unter den Anwesenden und wünsche in diesem Sinne einen interessanten Vormittag. Danke.
Ja, vielen Dank, Hanna Simons. Die wirtschaftliche Perspektive, es ist jetzt schon mehrmals angesprochen werden und ein ganz zentrales Thema ist dabei jenes der Investitionen und in welche Richtung Investitionen gelenkt werden und überhaupt ausgelöst werden. Das ist jetzt der Teil, wo im Programm auch angekündigt wird, und ich werde versuchen, das mitten im Satz zu machen. We're gonna switch to English language. Hope that's okay for everyone. We come to our keynote speaker. For those who follow the international debate, the Bloomberg New Energy Finance provides excellent data on energy markets, on energy policies, on investments, and is an important hub for all information and analysis. Bloomberg New Energy Finance was founded in 2004 by Michael Liebreich and then acquired in 2009 by Bloomberg. For those who have a Twitter account, I can really recommend to follow Mike Liebreich. It's always very interesting what he provides via Twitter. That doesn't mean that you necessarily have to be his opinion, but it's always interesting what he tweets. The New Energy Outlook is the annual report with a long-term view on energy markets, investments, and this is a very important perspective for all strategies. So I welcome the Chief Editor of Bloomberg New Energy Finance, Angus McCrone, on stage. Please welcome. If you need a water, that's
Dankeschön, Georg, and also to Peter and Hannah for their remarks. My German isn't very good, unfortunately, but two words seem to come up a lot in what they were saying. One was Energiewende, and the other one was Trump. So I think it's a sign of the time. So hopefully we can talk about some of these things this morning. Bloomberg New Energy Finance, as Georg was saying, has been going for about 12 years, and we sort of have teams of people covering all the sort of major things in what we call the clean energy transition. So wind, solar, gas, power markets in Europe, in Americas, in Asia, what we call energy smart technologies. So that's everything to do with smart grid, energy storage, demand response, those kind of issues. Electric vehicles is an area of incredible interest to our clients at the moment. How does that fit in with the power system? And we also look at how all these things are financed. So what are the different financing techniques that are coming in to deal with these big changes? And as Georg was saying, we put together this big forecast every year that involves something like 45 different analysts at different points, sort of crunching numbers and coming up with a scenario taking the energy system of the electricity system of the world out to 2040. So this morning, I'm going to sort of talk about these things. Clean energy investment trends in 2016, what's happening this year, and then look at different aspects of our New Energy Outlook forecast. So the costs and economics that lie behind that forecast. What about the shape of the global power system to 2040? And then what about emissions? What are the implications there? Are they good or are they bad, or are they somewhere in between? So first of all, clean energy investment trends. And here's a picture of a solar project. Solar and wind have been attracting a lot of new investors over the last few years, and there's one there and just on top of the solar panel. Really, it's captured the imagination as an investment in a way that wasn't the case 2 or 3 years ago. These are the figures we put together on global clean energy investment worldwide, and you can see an upward, what you'd say was an upward trend since 2004. First of all, a period of a very sharp increase. Then there was a sort of interim record figure in 2011 where at that point there were small-scale solar booms going on in Germany and Italy in particular, and that was behind a lot of the activity. There were then 2 years of declines, and then in 2015 we had a new record year. But actually the trend is much more impressive than it looks on this chart, because what the chart doesn't capture is the number of megawatts being installed. This is the dollars committed, and if the dollar costs of the megawatts has been falling, which it has, then you get a lot more megawatts per dollar than was the case before. So what does that total include? This is what we call a waterfall. So this is all the different elements of investment that are included in that figure. We're not including large hydro in that figure because that's a very mature technology, totally different sort of dynamics. But we've got venture capital and private equity investment in clean energy on the left-hand side. We've got research and development by companies and governments, and public markets new equity. So if a specialist clean energy company raises money on the stock markets, whether it's Tesla Motors or Vestas Wind Systems or whatever, that's included in that figure. So that takes us to $50 billion, and that's what you could call sort of technology and company level investment in 2015. And then we have $228 billion, which is renewable energy asset finance. So that's utility scale projects in wind, solar, geothermal, biomass, small hydro. And then $20 billion of digital energy and storage asset finance. So that's battery projects, smart grid, smart meter spending. And then SDC is small distributed capacity. So that's small scale solar projects of less than 1 megawatt, which was $58 billion. And then that takes you to the $349 billion total for 2015. And then there's another element, which is money changing hands, $97 billion worth of M&A buyouts, refinancings. So that's part of the activity picture, but not part of the new investment. Now, one of the things that sort of excited me over the years is the way the clean energy trend has broadened out geographically. So it used to be all about sort of Western Europe plus the US and then China, but it's really broadened out massively over the years. And this is the top 20 investing countries in 2015. There's a lot of names there you'd never have seen a few years ago. South Africa, Mexico, Chile, Turkey, the Philippines, Morocco, a lot of developing countries becoming significant investors in clean energy. It also shows just how important China has been to the overall global investment. It accounted for about a third of the world total in 2015. Now, Austria, unfortunately, is not in this top 20, but I did look at the Austrian figures, and Austria invested $546 million in clean energy in 2015. It was actually a bit higher than that in 2012. It got over $1 billion. So there are things going on in Austria, in solar and wind particularly, but not quite enough to get into that top 20 at the moment, unfortunately. So what about this year? What's happening this year? Well, these are our quarterly numbers. So we crunch the numbers quarterly. Not all of those elements I showed you a minute ago can be broken down by quarter. For instance, company R&D spending is only shown generally in annual reports, not in quarterly reports, so you can't produce a quarterly figure. And there are one or two other things that also you can't break down by quarter, but most of the things you can. And you can see that actually, so far in 2016, it's been a bit of a weaker trend worldwide. I'll come on to some of the reasons for that in a second. But the other thing that's interesting on this is if you look at the different colours, green is Europe, Middle East and Africa, blue is the Americas, and red is Asia Pacific. And you can see that sort of going back to the end of the last decade, Europe was very, very dominant as the investor in clean energy. The Americas was sort of up one year and down another due to sort of incentive programs in the US. And Asia was small but growing. But in more recent periods, Asia's been very much the dominant part of the world for investment in clean energy. Europe, less important. Okay, so what's happening behind those figures in 2016? Well, first of all, there's a slowdown going on in China. So there was a real rush to deploy projects at the end of 2015, and then we've had a sort of hangover effect in 2016. Also, costs have been coming down in China. So even if people are still building a lot of solar projects, for instance, the cost of those solar projects is much less than it would have been before, so a lower dollar number. Japanese solar boom is also cooling, but again, it's not cooling that much. It's more lower costs, particularly there this year. Their costs were always rather high before, but they've come down sharply, so lower dollar investment. Third point there, European offshore wind, that's been going in the opposite direction. So we've already had a record year for European offshore wind. Something like $20 billion has been committed already this year, exceeding 2015's record $17 billion. And then US and wind and solar markets, there was a decision by Congress in December 2015 to extend support via the tax credit program to them for 5 years. So we think that despite the presidential election result, that's likely to stay in place. So that's really supported those sectors in the US. And then the other important thing is auction programs. Not everybody likes them, but they're producing some really amazingly low cost figures, particularly in some of the developing countries. So we've seen a record low for solar of $29.10 per megawatt hour in Chile in August, and that beat a succession of other records coming through from Peru, Morocco, Mexico, United Arab Emirates, and so on. So a big trend there of sort of lower costs. And on auctions, it's been a real trend in the last few years that we've gone from the sort of early support programs, which were things like feed-in tariffs, tax incentives, green certificates, onto auctions in more and more countries worldwide. And broadly, we're in favour of auctions because we think they are forcing down costs quite sharply, causing everybody in the value chain to make a bit less money. But the result is that it's better value for money for the consumer. They were really pioneered in Brazil. It was the first country that really had auctions on a big scale. But they've really taken off. South Africa's had a very successful auction program. Auctions are coming in the UK and in Germany. I think end of this month there's wind auctions in Italy. So it's really an important trend that we're seeing. And that's contributed, it's not been the only factor by any means, but it's contributed to what's been happening on the costs of some of these renewable energy technologies. So if we look at these three, so we've got onshore wind is the dark blue line, offshore wind is the light blue line, and solar PV is the yellow line. Since 2009, on the levelized cost of electricity model that we produce, solar PV costs have come down by something like 65%, really massive reduction. Onshore wind, it doesn't look like much because it's a fairly flat-looking line compared to solar, but it's still a reduction of between 15 and 20%. And offshore wind, for a time, costs went up. And remember, this is an average. There's a big range around this. But for a while, costs went up as projects moved out to deeper water. But more recently, there's been sharp reductions in costs, some of that driven by auctions, places like the Netherlands and Denmark, but also a lot of it driven by real improvements in the costs of turbines and new techniques for installing them and so on. Now, the other thing that's going on that's really significant in terms of the future of the energy system is the electric vehicle revolution. So this is a Tesla here. In 2015, there were 442,000 electric vehicles sold worldwide, up 64% year on year. And global sales in the second quarter of 2016 were up 60% on the previous year, making about 1.6% of car sales. And battery prices have been a lot behind this. As the industry scaled up, battery prices have fallen 65% since 2010, and as you'll see, we expect that to continue. So just a final thing on sort of 2016 and the sort of historic record. This chart comes from a report we do every year for UNEP, the United Nations Environment Programme, and it shows the percentage, the renewable energy capacity that's installed each year as a percentage of the global capacity change. And this is renewable energy excluding large hydro. And in 2015, for the first time, it was a majority of the capacity installed worldwide, something like 54%. The other line that's interesting here is the bottom one, which is the percentage of generation of electricity worldwide that's accounted for by these new renewable technologies. And it's still only 10.3%. But if you extrapolate that in terms of the saved carbon emissions, it's already something like 1.5 gigatons. So it's really quite important already. Okay, so let's look ahead. As I said, we produced this new energy outlook. The 2016 edition came out in late June. So this is what I'm going to show you. There'll obviously be another one next June, and we already are thinking about some of the things that are going to be important in next year's forecast. Now, here's a picture of a lot of money, because it is going to take a lot of money to drive this clean energy transition, this Energiewende. If you look at that closely, actually, you can see that that's Venezuelan bolivars. Actually, it's probably worth about 5 euro cents. But hopefully it gets across the picture that a lot of money is involved in this. Some people who are skeptical about our forecast say, well, what are your assumptions for fossil fuel prices? What if they get cheaper and they get more competitive and so on? So this is what we're assuming for coal and gas prices. Coal prices at the top, gas prices at the bottom. So in our 2015 edition of the forecast, we had coal prices sort of in the $70 area out during the whole of our forecast period. And we reduced that significantly to only just over $40. So we're actually assuming in our forecasts very low coal prices historically. On gas, we had a higher forecast in 2015 when we did this exercise than we had in 2016. So we think gas prices have been very low recently, and they will rise, but that rise will be fairly slow. So coal, gas, and actually oil prices are going to remain relatively low throughout this forecast period. So we're not talking about sort of renewables coming through because fossil fuel gets expensive. Definitely not. So let's look at prices of a couple of things in the transition. First of all, starting off with small-scale solar and then looking at storage. So if you look at small-scale solar capital expenditure per watt, now we reckon with solar PV there's what we call an experience curve of about 24%. So for every doubling of capacity worldwide, then cost per watt come down by about 24%. And that's a very aggressive line, and it's been in place since the 1970s. And we don't see any sign of that coming to an end at all. So small-scale solar PV capex, which includes not just the actual module, but also the balance of plant and installation and so on, we think that's going to reduce by about another 2/3 by 2040. So there's going to be a really major improvement in solar costs once again through this period. And then if we look at storage, also there's an experience curve in effect there, and we think in that case it's about a 19% curve. So every time capacity of lithium-ion batteries worldwide doubles, then costs come down by about 19%. So there we're looking at again, major reductions in storage costs worldwide. So that makes all kinds of things possible in terms of balancing the world electricity system. And also it drives the expansion of electric vehicles. What about wind? Well, I haven't got exactly the same chart for wind, but one thing that's been very apparent in our research is that it isn't just, with wind, it hasn't just been turbines getting cheaper as you get sort of more competitive manufacturing, bigger factories and so on. It's also been the capacity factor has improved vastly on wind. So the amount of electricity you can actually get compared to the nameplate capacity has improved drastically as the products themselves have improved, but also as you've had changes like you have turbines that are maybe not going to produce as much electricity at the highest wind conditions, but at lower wind conditions, which are more typical, they'll produce more. So we've seen capacity factors with wind improving from something in the low teens back at the turn of the century up towards the high 20s now. And in offshore wind, obviously, the capacity factors are much higher and can get up to 45% or even 50%. And we see that these kind of improvements continuing too. So I just brought out Germany as an example of these sort of comparative costs. So at the moment in 2016, if you're building new electricity capacity, then the cheapest option is onshore wind in Germany. That's the blue square you can see on the left-hand column for 2016. And then gas probably second, and then solar, there's a bit of a wide range, but it's kind of vying with gas and coal. Coal's probably the most expensive. There's a current carbon price factored in there as well. Admittedly, the carbon price is not high. But that's the comparison now. And if you go out to 2040, the comparison just gets more and more stark. You end up with solar and wind, due to these technological improvements that we've been talking about, becoming vastly the cheapest new technologies to build in terms of cost per megawatt hour. And coal and gas get left a long way behind. Again, there's a carbon price built in that, so there's a carbon price forecast in that, but it's not responsible for more than a part of that change. So if we look at, that was sort of new build v new build, but what about if we look at new build renewables v old build fossil fuels, in other words, the fossil fuel plant that's already there. So this shows CCGT, a combined cycle gas, against new build solar and wind in Germany again. And you can see that at the moment it's probably cheaper to keep your gas-fired power stations running rather than build new solar and wind to replace them. But that is going to change. By the middle of the 2020s, it'll be cheaper to build a new wind plant rather than continue to run an old gas plant. And the same will happen with solar. It'll take slightly longer. It'll be the sort of late 2020s in Germany. But that's another really important change in terms of this competitiveness. When does it become economic to actually replace what you've already got with new solar and wind? Okay, so let's look at what all this means for the shape of the global power system to 2040. Right, I've got another picture here. Does anybody know what that is? It's actually something that's very relevant to all this, and that's lithium. Yeah, somebody said it over there, lithium. So this is a lithium mine in Bolivia, and lithium is going to become one of the key commodities in this period of energy transition. And we don't see it as being a problem for the transition. We think there's plenty of lithium out there. That doesn't mean there's not going to be price spikes, because as we saw with polysilicon at the end of the last decade, you can have periods of shortages and big price rises, but in the end, supply does catch up with demand. Okay, so what about electricity demand? So that's been a really interesting area in the last few years, because electricity demand, particularly in developed economies, has really undershot what people were expecting since the financial crisis. How is that going to change out to 2040? So this showed, hopefully people can see it or at least sort of imagine what it says. So this is different parts of the world and what's going to happen to electricity demand over the next few years in each of those places. And the two lines that really stand out are India and China. So there's still going to be a lot of electricity demand growth in India and China. Some other areas, Middle East and North Africa down near the bottom, going to be big increases, sub-Saharan Africa to some extent. Southeast Asia also important. So some parts of the world there's going to be significant increases in electricity demand. But we think in the developed world there won't be. Actually, electricity demand will fall in the US slightly out to 2040, and in Europe, Canada, and in Japan it'll continue falling. It's already fallen a lot compared to where it was before the financial crisis. So this is based on some very detailed work we've done on what is the electricity demand for economies at different stages of economic development in relation to their GDP. And that's really being shifted as new technologies like efficient lighting and refrigeration and air conditioning have come in. The sort of peak of electricity demand as a percentage of GDP has shifted down considerably, and we think a lot of that will be spilled out into the emerging markets. So electricity demand growth will not be as great globally as a lot of the other forecasters are saying. It'll still be some demand growth, as you can see on the left, but it won't be nearly as much as some of the other forecasters say. And what about electric vehicles? Let's go back to them. So this chart shows what's the percentage of new car sales worldwide that will be accounted for by electric vehicles during the course of the next 25 years. We're saying that by 2040 they're going to make up 35% of the world total new car sales. So by that time it'll be about a quarter of the actual fleet of the cars that are driving around the roads. And that was a forecast we made in February. Now, at the time when we made that forecast, a lot of people were saying, these guys from Bloomberg New Energy Finance, they're completely wild. This is far too aggressive. Electric vehicles are never going to be 35% of new car sales by 2040. But actually what we've found since then is that everybody's starting to agree with us now. And that makes us worried. So we're thinking that we're actually probably too conservative now with that forecast. So 35% by 2040. And in terms of the implications, we've looked at the implications for a lot of different sectors, and some of them are really fascinating. But in terms of electricity, it's going to add about 8% to world electricity demand by 2040, which is some good news actually for utilities. But it's going to also reduce crude oil demand by about 13 million barrels per day. So that's not good for certain economies out there that make their living from selling oil. What about power generation? Because that's the kind of nub of all this, really. And here people say, okay, well, your power generation forecasts, they must be based on sort of new aggressive policies coming in to deal with climate change. They're actually not. They're based on current policies and particularly on economics, how the economics is going to change between different technologies. And this is the result that we come out with. So this is global installed capacity and additions by technology out to 2040. So this is the additional stuff that's going to be built every year. And you can see the two dominant colours that are going to be built on the basis of economics are going to be wind in blue and solar in yellow. There's still going to be a little bit of coal, unfortunately. There's going to be some gas, but not as much as the IEA said when it talked about a golden age of gas. The other thing to note here is what I would call the purple colour or mauve colour at the top, and that's flexible capacity. And that's necessary to balance the system when you have large amounts of wind and solar. And that could be many things. That could be fast ramp-up gas engines. That'll probably be part of it. It could be a lot of batteries. We think it will be. It could be a lot of demand response. It could be interconnectors. So all those things are going to be part of that flexible capacity at the top. Overall, we think that $11.4 trillion is going to be invested in new power generation between now and 2040, and that 7.8 trillion will go into renewables, including large hydro, and another 1.5 trillion into nuclear. We think nuclear will get that investment, mainly because there's a lot of political impetus behind nuclear in different parts of the world. It's not that it's the cheapest technology, certainly isn't, but there's political momentum there. Okay, so where will that leave the shape of the generating fleet? We've got the power mix in 2015 and the power mix in 2040. You can see the solar proportion goes up from 4% to 29%. This is in gigawatts, not in gigawatt hours. The wind proportion goes up from 7% to 13%. There's still some coal, 16%, but down from 31%. And then the flexible capacity I talked about was 2% back in 2015, is going to grow to 8%. So big changes. You can't turn around this power system quickly, but these, over the course of 25 years, those are very big changes. What does that mean at the country level? How important could solar and wind become in different countries? Well, here we've got various countries. The green line is the proportion that solar and wind make up of generation in different countries at the moment. So at the top we got Germany. It's kind of getting towards 20%. The UK, it's about sort of 13%. Australia, it's nearly 10%. China, maybe about 7% at the moment. But out to 2040, we think it's going to account for some very high figures. So it'll be above 60% in Germany. Mexico, we think it'll be nearly 60%. In the UK, it'll be above 50%. And even in some of these developing economies like India, for instance, near the bottom, we've got it accounting for nearly 20%. Okay, so what does this mean, generation by fuel type out to 2040 globally? You can see at the top, unfortunately, fossil fuels are going to remain pretty important, and the fossil fuel line is relatively flat between 2015 and 2040, and we'll see what the implications of that are for emissions in a minute. Solar and wind, very sharply increasing line. Other renewables also important, so hydro, geothermal, biomass and so on, also significant, and nuclear is actually going to grow out to 2040 on our forecasts. But that is very much complicated by region, as we'll see. So if we look at the OECD, this is coal, gas and oil-fired generation by region. If we look at the OECD as the top line in blue, you can see that fossil fuel generation is going to become much less important in the developed economies. But in India and Southeast Asia, which is the grey line, as those economies develop, there's going to be a lot more fossil fuel generation. So that really is the place where we've got to watch in terms of new coal capacity in particular being commissioned and fired up. Okay, so finally, let's look at emissions. And this picture here is actually of a coal-fired power station being demolished. So we need a few of those things to happen to get emissions to come down. What about we looked at the sort of fossil fuel generation by region just now. What about the emissions by region? And here, again, it just shows how vital India is in terms of the world emissions trend. On current projections and given what we expect with electricity demand, population growth, GDP, India is going to be the major problem in terms of, or the major challenge in terms of emissions worldwide, and actually gives huge responsibility to that country in terms of the decisions it makes. Southeast Asia is also going to be a very significant part of emissions in that time. China, we think probably the worst period of emissions growth is over, and it's going to be a fairly flat line and eventually declining out to 2040. And the US and Europe, we're both going to, in both cases, we're going to see significant falls in emissions. And we can talk about Donald Trump in the Q&A part, but we don't think that Donald Trump is actually going to affect that emissions trend in the US, because remember, this is about economics, and unless he decides to throw the economics out of the window, the future is fairly clear on that front. Okay, power sector emissions, we got a bit more optimistic between the 2015 forecast and the 2016 forecast. So we brought down our line for future emissions, but we're still left with a position where emissions in 2040 are going to be higher than they were in 2015 by about 10%. They may be down from a peak in the late 2020s, but it's still a very worrying picture in terms of the world climate. It's sort of encouraging in terms of, yes, renewables are taking over and we have got this energy transition, but in terms of the climate, it's worrying. And what would we need to do to hit the 2-degree scenario that the UN FCCC talks about? Well, it would mean emissions coming down on that green line rather than staying relatively flat on the grey line. And on our estimates, it would mean the additional investment of about 5.3 trillion on top of those numbers I gave you a moment ago for, this is in dollars, for renewable energy investment, which I think was 7.8 trillion. So another 5.3 trillion would have to be invested in zero carbon generating capacity by 2040. Unless, of course, there's some breakthrough in terms of energy efficiency or something else that changes it. But that's a pretty stark number in terms of the investment requirement. So thank you very much for your attention. That's everything from me for the moment.
Thank you very much, Angus. So we see that there's a kind of breakthrough in the renewable energy sector. Nevertheless, we're far away from the 2 degrees Celsius path. So I want to introduce some panelists right now. Again, Peter Püschböck from Renewable Energy Association, Mr. Frank Durmeier from WEB Windenergie, and Magister Jürgen Streitler from the Austrian Federal Ministry of Science, Research and Economy. Just take very brief questions which give the opportunity to maybe comment on the presentation by Angus. One obvious question is, we see the investments in renewable energy, and we see that investments in Europe are going down, and Austria is not on the top 20 list. What do you think? What's the conditions for investments right now, and what can be done better, and how do we get Austria on the top 20 list? So whoever wants to start.
Maybe we start. WEB Wind Energy is a company based in Austria. We are since 20 plus years in the market. We are a strong Austrian company, but we also are working in 7 countries on 2 continents. We have in North America, in the US, we are right now erecting the first wind park in the US. We are building in Canada wind parks right now, in Germany, in France, Italy. We are participating in the auction system next week. What has happened in Austria? Certainly we need in Austria stable conditions. The law, what we have right now, I call it, it's really limited. It's on the end. When you designed it a couple of years ago, we had different prices, different assumptions. And I think a couple of years ago we had an agreement that around 300 megawatt wind a year could be a good threshold, a good target for Austria. But today, looking at the Austria law, what we have for wind and for renewables energy, basically we don't get the volume. What your volumes built, we have a long waiting line in Austria, over 700 megawatts, developed wind parks, developed energy which we can bring to the market. And here, I think that's my comment as a developer and operator. We need some stable conditions. We have a pretty good picture how to reach 2030 in a good way, and we have seen the numbers in the morning that it's cheaper than the fossil energy. That's cheaper than coal and anything else. So from our side, basically we're ready for it if we need and have stable conditions from the legal side.
Thank you. So maybe Mr. Streitner, how can Austria get part of this international development right now?
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. And first of all, let me apologize that Michael Losch, our Director General, wasn't able to attend today. He's on a business trip. Is the micro working? Yeah. And he asked me to replace him, so I'm happy to be here, especially when I've seen such an interesting presentation of Bloomberg. We've seen in the presentation, well, Paris Agreement was a huge success. It's the first time that all countries are together in an agreement, and we saw that we need large investments in the energy system. Generally, I think there's a positive aspect and a negative aspect. The positive we've seen is that prices especially for renewable technologies were going down. So it's economies of scale. It's a big success. And the negative effect we see at the moment in the distortions of the electricity market, especially. So there was an enormous increase of renewables produced in Austria, for example, also plus 12% in 2015 compared to 2014. We have different support schemes in Europe, and the decreasing electricity prices is, of course, an issue that leads to a lack of investments in this sector on the market. So what can be done? You've mentioned the Austrian Ökostromgesetz, the renewable electricity bill. First of all, just to say that the European Union will come up in November 2015 with a market design regulation. I think this will be an important step. And secondly, yes, we're working on our renewable electricity bill. You know that, and especially I want to say that investments in general will be a big issue and is a big issue within our energy and climate strategies, which we are preparing at the moment. And we had also working groups on this topic, so this is a continuing big issue.
Thank you. Peter, I just want to, everyone in Austria knows your background in the banking sector, being CEO of Raiffeisen Landesbank Wien Niederösterreich for a long time. So you know a lot about investments. How can we create more investments in the clean energy sector?
I think the investments that we have seen here in the presentations are really impressive, and fortunately we have worldwide a situation where we have no problem in financing this energy transition, because there's enough money around, it's very cheap money, so it's an excellent opportunity to really push forward this energy transition. If we had interest rates of 6, 7, 8, 9% as we had it could be a financing problem. Fortunately, this is no financing problem, and also in Austria we have absolutely no financing problem. It's just a problem of getting the market to the levels where they should be, and we have seen the levels. So we are now fighting with market distortions, and we have to really find ways to get around those market distortions. I'm glad that Bloomberg New Energy Financing is making such presentations, because you have much more credibility that we have as people who are working in that industry, and that credibility really helps us. I would be very interested to get together in 3-5 years again, because I feel that your forecasts are a little too pessimistic in terms of the development of the renewable energy, especially as far as the development of e-mobility, of electric vehicles is concerned, because it will very shortly, in about 5 to 10 years, prove that electric vehicles are cheaper in the purchase price, are cheaper to run, and so there is no reason. Actually, it has to be a very a decision to stay in fossil fuel in combustion cars, and therefore I'm much more optimistic, and I think that will also change the picture, because the e-mobility will change the picture, because the large automobile manufacturers are completely new players in that game, and they will change the name of the game. As far as the battery development is concerned, and the battery development has to do with the whole picture of renewable energy, and that I think will boost the system starting in about 5 years, but then for the next 15 years we will have a complete change of the system.
Thank you. You want to comment on one of the points?
Yes, could I comment on Peter's point in particular, because I think yes, the chart showing the 35% of electric vehicles in new car sales by 2040 worldwide. I mean, when we first published it, as I was saying, people were saying this is far too aggressive. And now when I show it at events, I get questions like, well, hang on a minute, why isn't it 100%? So opinion has changed very quickly on this. I mean, two things I'd say on that. One is that the sort of internal combustion cars won't stand still during this period. They will improve their economy rate considerably to try and compete. And also the other thing that's in there is hybrid electric vehicles. So things like the Toyota Prius, we think those will continue to be strong competitors against electric vehicles for a long time. So they're likely to make up another large part of the market in 2040. So yes, I mean, we can argue about whether 35% is the right figure or not. Maybe too low. The next time we do it, we may have a higher figure. But I think another interesting area, and this goes back to what Peter said about e-mobility, is that electric vehicles will have spin-off effects on all kinds of other sectors of the economy, including other parts of transportation. So if we get much more powerful and efficient engines in electric passenger cars, then what will that mean for buses, for trucks, and even for ships and aircraft? So all of those areas open up. Some of them look a bit more unlikely than others. But it was interesting that the two guys who flew the solar plane around the world recently, when they sort of set up that project back in about 2010, they said publicly, well, of course, there's no way that aeroplanes will ever be anything other than based on fossil fuels or perhaps biofuel, because there won't be enough power density in electric engines to make it possible to replace them. When they actually completed the flight this year, they said, we've changed our mind. We reckon that within 10 years or so, we will start to see passenger planes using electric engines rather than internal combustion engines. So even in that area, we may see change. But there's a lot of other areas that will spill over from the electric vehicle revolution.
Thank you. One question which goes to you, but to the other panelists, of course, too. The one slide we have seen on the gap to the 2-degree path. And on the other hand, we've seen the new capacities will be mostly renewable, not only but mostly. But there is still a lot of coal and fossil energy in the electricity mix. So one task might be, how do we get fossil fuels and coal out of the mix, not to produce overcapacities, for example. What do you think might be an approach concerning price signal, for example? Is the development of carbon pricing right now we see in many regions, is that one of the approaches which can be the future?
Well, I mean, that's very much the problem that a lot of Europe has, is that there's all this old capacity, electricity demand is weak, electricity prices are low, but it's not really worthwhile to replace existing capacity in fossil fuels with renewables because the price signal isn't there to do that. So as I showed in one of the charts, there will come a point in the 2020s when it'll actually be cheaper to replace the installed fossil fuel capacity with new wind or solar, but we're maybe 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years away from that point. So what happens in the interim period? Well, one possible approach is carbon pricing, but carbon prices in Europe are very low, far too low really to have that effect. They're far too low even to make people switch very much from coal to gas. So that's one approach. Another approach is just to say, and the UK government has done this, is to say we won't have any coal after a particular date in the future. So they've said by 2023 or 2025 at the latest, there will be no coal-fired capacity. Therefore, that's going to have to close, and that gives certainty to the industry that they have to build something else to replace it. So that's another approach. But it is a difficult problem, as you say.
Thank you. Any comments from you on the question, how do we get to the Paris Agreement path?
As far as the carbon pricing is concerned, I think we should look at the two sides of the carbon pricing. The one is the cost, the real cost of energy production. On the other side, the energy efficiency. And I think that there are right now too little incentives for really tackle that big and very important topic of energy efficiency. And I think that can be really boosted by introducing carbon pricing, which I would favor very much.
Any further comments?
I think the idea of a strong declaration that carbon has to stop, coal has to stop, that's a very strong sign every country has and can do. On the other hand, the increase of carbon prices, I think in Europe has proven that this hasn't worked in the past and why it should work in the future. But one other step we also can do, we can stop paying subsidies to the coal. And I think if countries are committing not paying hidden subsidies, which are getting paid to the coal or only half it, then we would have, or we will see very quick steps that coal is getting out of the business because it's getting much more expensive and quicker, as you have shown in your graphs.
Thank you. Mr. Streitner, maybe?
Yeah, just one word on carbon pricing. We are a big fan of the EU ETS and carbon pricing. It's a very important thing, but as coming from the Ministry of Economy, I also have to mention the role of industry in this point of case. So there's demand. A lot of people are asking for higher prices, but we also have to see the industry in terms of having installed an installation with a with 40 years lifetimes, no carbon price will be able to switch to that the industry will buy another installation. So this is a really, really big problem. So carbon leakage provisions will be necessary in the future. And if you have that, it also will allow to have higher prices in the market, I would say. And I think at the moment we have the revision of the ETS directive on the table, and there's also very good points in it. For example, we have to support the industry, and for example, there is the NER 400 system, so to support the industry to auction allowances and get the money from the ETS companies to the ETS companies, but in a low carbon way. So this is a big good thing, I would say.
Okay, we have time for 3 questions. So if please focus on questions. So I see Heinz Hügelsberger, Erwin Meyer, Monika Langthaler. There is a microphone, so Florian, please.
You said your forecasts are based only just on economics, without any political interference, with the exception of nuclear. But what I don't understand is why is there this high coal mix in India if economic laws should be the same worldwide? How can you explain that coal is obviously cheaper in India than the rest of the world?
If okay, I would collect the questions.
Okay.
Yeah. Erwin Meyer.
You mentioned the carbon prices in your slides. Which carbon prices did you assume? Is it 10 euro or 20 euro, whatever? The second question is, you said the fossil prices will go up again, and I doubt that, because if we have a 1.5 degrees Celsius pass or 2 degrees Celsius pass, a lot of the fossil fuel have to stay in the ground, so we have an oversupply, and if the costs are going down from renewables, so we have an under demand. So both would say that fossil fuel prices will be very low in the future, but in your assumptions they go up. Please explain that.
Thank you. And Monika Langthaler.
Thank you. Regarding the split of the countries, I was surprised that Africa didn't play any role in one of your slides. So I would be interested in the role of Africa, especially because the increase of the population is enormous until 2050. And secondly, the last slide where we saw the projection for 2040 regarding what would be needed for Paris and what you forecasting. How many degrees would this would lie behind those difference?
Thank you. So we have some questions on regional differences, India, Africa, and on carbon pricing, fossil prices too.
Okay, so first one, coal in India. In India, there's a lot of locally mined coal, which is very cheap actually, and because it's local, it costs very little to transport it to the power generating plant. And also, at the moment, some of the regulations on the extraction of the coal and on the burning of it are much less tight than they are in some other parts of the world. So actually, I showed you sort of global averages for costs, but actually, if we also do it by region and by country, and that coal in India stays cheap compared even to solar and wind. They get cheap too, but they don't get cheap quickly enough to displace coal because it's so cheap there. So that's the answer in the case of India. On carbon pricing, we're assuming in our forecasts, for instance, an increase in the EU ETS carbon price. I can't remember the exact number, but I think it's something in the 20 euros plus during the 2020s. As I say, I can't remember where it goes in the 2030s, but yeah, there is some increase in carbon prices, but not reaching the kind of level where it becomes a decisive factor in making people switch from coal to gas or coal to renewables. Then fossil fuels prices up or down. Actually, the slide I showed a flat coal price out to 2040 and some increase in the gas price. And I agree that if you have an industry whose products are less in demand over time, you'd expect those prices to come down. But remember that the fossil fuel generation line is relatively flat. So there is still going to be demand, unfortunately, for coal out to 2040. It has come down in price massively over the course of the last few years. So our forecast is flat. Maybe our forecast is too high. But if coal prices and gas prices end up being lower than we're saying, then that's more of a challenge for renewables. I'm happy that we've got a sort of reasonable balance in terms of what we're saying for coal and gas. In the case of gas, we've had the shale gas revolution in the US, and we think that the easiest to extract of that North American shale gas will get used up in a relatively short number of years. So you will then be left with the more difficult to extract gas, which will be a bit more expensive. So that lies behind that sort of gentle upward slope in the gas price. On the role of Africa, yes, Africa will be quite important. One advantage Africa's got is that because its industrialization is happening later than China or even India, it will to some extent leapfrog some of the technologies that are being used in those countries. So when Africa gets to its sort of peak period of industrialization and its economic development starts to sort of rival some of the other developing economies, we think that its energy intensity will be considerably lower than was the case for some of the other developing economies prior to that. And then the other thing was how many degrees centigrade of global warming would be implicit in our figures for what's going to happen to the energy system. Well, we haven't directly made that calculation, but it's certainly the case that it's going to be more than 2 degrees. It's probably not the 4 degrees which people were in the climate sector, if I can call it that, were particularly worried about a few years ago. Probably something nearer to 3 degrees, but I don't have a kind of actual figure to give you, unfortunately.
Thank you very much. Thanks for coming to Vienna. It was a real pleasure. Thanks all to all the panelists.